There are vows that bind kingdoms, contracts that seal fates. And then there are arrangements that reveal what kind of ruler a king truly is when no one is watching. King Morvith Darksunder had ruled for 847 years. He had negotiated treaties that ended centuries-long wars, accepted tributes from kingdoms spanning 3 continents, and seen every variation of political marriage that mortal imagination could devise. But nothing, not in 8 centuries of immortal existence, had prepared him for the arrangement Lord Thornwick proposed. The letter had been clinical. Lord Thornwick owed the vampire crown a debt so substantial it threatened to destabilize the entire Thornwick province. Failed harvests, mismanaged trade routes, gambling losses. The sum was staggering, enough gold to fund a small war. Lord Thornwick couldn't pay in gold, so he offered his daughter instead. The contract was brutally clear: Princess Marvella Thornwick, ward and eventual bride to King Morvith Darksunder, in full settlement of debts owed to the vampire crown. Morvith had signed without much thought. Another duty, another obligation. He would educate the princess at court and eventually marry her to satisfy the political arrangement. Standard. Distasteful, but standard. He sent for the girl and waited. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your country or city in the comments below, and hit subscribe to see how this immortal king handles the most unexpected arrival of his very long life. The carriage arrived on the first day of autumn. Morvith stood in the grand courtyard of Darksunder Keep, dressed in ceremonial armor, midnight black plate etched with silver runes. At nearly 8 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to cast shadows across 3 men, he cut an imposing figure even among his own kind. This was a first impression that mattered. This woman would eventually be his queen. The carriage door opened. A servant stepped out, dropping into a bow so deep his forehead nearly touched the cobblestones. "Your Majesty, I bring the princess." "As contracted." "Bring her out," Morvith said. "Let me greet her properly." The servant's face went pale. He turned back to the carriage, reached inside, and helped someone down. And Morvith's 800-year-old world came to a complete, shattering halt. Because the girl who stepped out wasn't a woman. She was a child. 16 at most, painfully thin, with tangled dark hair and an ill-fitting dress hanging off her small frame. Her face was pale, her eyes, striking violet, were wide with terror. And she was staring up at him like he was a monster from her worst nightmares. This is a child. What kind of father sends his daughter? How old is she? The words came out harder than he intended. "16, Your Majesty." Lord Thornwick said the contract didn't specify exact age. "Where is Lord Thornwick?" "He couldn't make the journey, Your Majesty." Of course the coward hadn't come. Because Thornwick knew exactly what he'd done. Morvith looked down at the girl. She was trembling violently, her hands twisted in her dress, knuckles white. She hadn't spoken, hadn't moved except to breathe in short, panicked gasps. And in her eyes, beneath the terror, he saw something else: defiance. "What is your name?" Morvith asked, making his voice as gentle as possible. The girl's chin lifted. When she spoke, her voice was thin but steady. "Princess Marvella Thornwick." A pause. Then, with surprising venom, "And I will never be your bride." The courtyard went silent. No one, absolutely no one, spoke to King Morvith Darksunder like that. Not kings, not generals, not the Immortal Council. And certainly not a 16-year-old human girl who barely came up to his chest. But instead of anger, Morvith felt overwhelming relief. Because that defiance told him everything. This wasn't a willing arrangement. This was a girl who had been sold by her father to pay his debts, and she knew it, and she hated it. Which meant Morvith had a choice to make. He could enforce the contract. It was legal, binding. Or he could do something that would shock his court and prove to this terrified child that not all powerful men were monsters. Morvith made his decision in a heartbeat. "Summon the full court," he said to his Lord Chancellor. Immediately. Every noble, every advisor, every witness in the throne room within the hour. He looked back at Marvella. You must be exhausted. My steward will show you to your chambers. In 1 hour, join me in the throne room. I have something I need to say to you, and I want witnesses. 1 hour later, the throne room was packed. Every noble, the full royal council, court scribes, even diplomatic envoys, this was clearly meant to be public record. Princess Marvella entered, now wearing a well-fitted dress in deep blue, her hair brushed and pulled back. She looked slightly less terrified and significantly more angry. She walked the length of the throne room with her head high. When she reached the throne, she executed a curtsy that was technically perfect, but deliberately minimal. Princess Marvella Thornwick, Morvith said. Do you understand why you were sent to me? Her jaw tightened. Yes. Tell the court. Her violet eyes flashed with fury, but she spoke clearly. My father owed the crown a debt he couldn't pay. So he sent me instead. As settlement. To be your ward and eventual bride. Murmurs rippled through the nobles. And did you agree to this arrangement? I'm 16 years old, Marvella said, her voice shaking with rage. I wasn't asked. I was told. Given 2 days to pack and sent here like property. Like payment, Morvith said quietly. Yes. He let the silence stretch. Then he stood. Lord Chancellor read the marriage clause. The Chancellor stepped forward. Upon delivery of Princess Marvella Thornwick to King Morvith Darksunder, she shall serve as his ward until such time as the king deems appropriate, whereupon she shall become his bride and queen. And that contract is legally binding? Yes, your majesty. I void it, Morvith said. The throne room exploded into chaos. Morvith raised one hand and silence fell. I, King Morvith Darksunder, formally and publicly void the marriage clause. Princess Marvella is my ward, that remains. She is under my protection. But she is not, and will never be required to be my bride. He looked down at Marvella, who was staring at him in absolute shock. You said you would never be my bride. I'm ensuring that remains your choice. You will live here under my protection. You will receive the finest education. And when you come of age, you will be free to choose your own path. That choice will be yours alone. Marvella's mouth opened. Closed. No sound came out. Do you understand, princess? She found her voice. Why? Because the contract your father signed was legal. But it wasn't right. And I have lived too long to enforce wrongness simply because it's convenient. He addressed the court. Let it be recorded. Princess Marvella Thornwick is under the protection of the vampire crown, but she is not bound to me in marriage. Her future is her own. You're dismissed, princess. Marvella didn't move. You're really not going to force me? Never, Morvith said simply. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then she executed another curtsy, this one deeper, genuine, and left without another word. The first 2 years were painful. Marvella accepted the education, the food, the luxurious chambers, and treated every kindness like a trap. She was perfectly, coldly, hostilely polite. Morvith understood. She'd been betrayed, sold to a monster. Of course she didn't trust him. But understanding didn't make it less painful. Because he actually liked her, her stubborn defiance, her fierce spirit that refused to be broken. And that was dangerous. She was 16. A child in his care. So Morvith built walls. Maintained distance. Treated her with perfect, formal courtesy and nothing more. It was the right thing to do. The honorable thing. It was also absolutely agonizing. Until the night of her 18th birthday, when Marvella requested a private word. I owe you an apology, she said. For 2 years of treating you like a monster when you've been nothing but honorable. You could have enforced that contract. But you chose my freedom. And I've punished you for my father's sins. She looked up at him. I'm sorry. And I want you to know that I respect you. Deeply. Morvith felt something crack in his chest. Thank you, princess. That means more than you know. She smiled, the first genuine smile she'd ever given him. Please. Call me Marvella. and the ice between them began, finally, to thaw. The thaw, once begun, proved impossible to stop. In the months following Marvella's 18th birthday, the cold formality that had defined their relationship for 2 years dissolved into something Morvith hadn't experienced in centuries: genuine friendship. She began joining him for breakfast in the small solar overlooking the eastern gardens, discussing the political treatises she was studying with an insight that consistently surprised him. She had a mind like a steel trap, sharp, unforgiving, capable of seeing through diplomatic language to the brutal truth beneath. More than once, she'd identified flaws in proposed treaties that his own counsel had missed. "This clause here," she'd say, tapping the parchment with one finger, "gives them an escape route if grain prices drop. They're betting on a bad harvest to void the agreement entirely." Morvith would lean over to examine her reasoning, catch the scent of lavender from her hair, and have to remind himself sternly that she was his ward. That the comfortable warmth spreading through his chest was inappropriate. That the way she lit up when he praised her intelligence was simply a student's natural response to a mentor's approval, nothing more. She started asking him about his long life, and he found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in decades. The early wars, the forging of the first treaties, the friends he'd lost, and the mistakes that still haunted him even after centuries. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked one evening as they walked through the castle gardens. "Living so long? Watching everyone you care about grow old and die?" Morvith considered the question carefully. She deserved honesty. Sometimes. But immortality isn't a curse if you find purpose in it. "I've had 800 years to protect this kingdom, to build something lasting. That matters more than the loneliness." "You're lonely." The surprise in her voice made him glance down at her. "Of course. Immortality means everyone you love becomes temporary. You learn to keep distance, to not attach too deeply, because the loss is inevitable." She was quiet for a long moment. "That sounds like a terrible way to live." "It's a practical way to survive." "Survival isn't the same as living," she said quietly, and the observation hit harder than she probably intended. These were the moments that terrified Morvith most. When her wisdom transcended her years. When he forgot she was 18 and saw only the brilliant, perceptive woman she was becoming. When the distinction between guardian and ward felt less like a clear boundary and more like an increasingly uncomfortable fiction. He enforced the boundaries ruthlessly. When she touched his arm while laughing at something he'd said, he'd step back, putting physical distance between them. When she suggested they spend an evening reading together in the library, he'd send her with books and retire to his own chambers alone. When the court musicians played and he saw her swaying to the music, looking at him with hopeful eyes, he'd bow formally and leave before she could ask him to dance. The hurt that flashed across her face during these small rejections was like a knife to his chest. But the alternative, allowing closeness that could be misinterpreted, that could make her feel pressured, that could transform their friendship into something tainted by the power imbalance between them, was unthinkable. His counsel noticed the change in her and commented frequently. "The princess has become quite remarkable," his Lord Chancellor observed. "Intelligent, diplomatic, well-loved by the staff and nobility alike. She'd make an excellent queen." The comment was casual, but Morvith heard the unspoken question beneath it. Many assumed the voided marriage contract had been temporary, that eventually the king and his ward would marry anyway. "She will make an excellent queen," Morvith agreed carefully. "For whatever kingdom is fortunate enough to earn her choice." She's 18 now. Of marriageable age. Have there been any inquiries from other houses? There had been. 7 formal proposals in 3 months alone. Princes, dukes, wealthy merchants' sons, all interested in the brilliant, beautiful princess under the Vampire King's protection. Morvith had presented each proposal to Marvella personally, maintaining perfect neutrality. She had rejected all of them without hesitation. "None of them interest me," she'd said simply. "You're under no pressure to accept anyone," Morvith had assured her. but you should consider the options. Some of these are genuinely good men from powerful families. She'd looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. I don't want an excellent life with a good man I don't care about. When I marry, if I marry, it will be because I've found someone I actually want to spend my life with. The conversation stayed with him for days afterward, an uncomfortable weight he couldn't shake. Because the truth he couldn't acknowledge, couldn't even fully admit to himself, was becoming harder to deny, he had fallen in love with her. Not with the frightened 16-year-old who'd arrived 4 years ago, but with the woman she'd become. Her fierce intelligence. Her unexpected kindness to those with less power. The way she challenged him and never backed down from an argument. Her stubborn insistence on doing what was right rather than what was easy. He loved her. And that love was the most dangerous thing that had happened to him in 800 years. Because Marvella was his ward. Under his protection. 18 to his 847. The power differential was staggering. Even if she developed feelings for him, and he had no reason to believe she had, those feelings could never be trusted. She'd lived under his roof, under his authority, dependent on his goodwill since she was 16. Any affection she felt might be gratitude misidentified as love. Or the simple fact that he was the most powerful person in her life, and she learned to associate safety with his presence. He could never act on his feelings. To do so would be to become exactly the monster she'd feared when she first arrived. So Morveth did what his honor demanded. He buried his love. He maintained the boundaries. He treated Marvella with distant kindness. And when she smiled at him during their morning conversations, when she laughed at his observations about court politics, when she looked at him with genuine warmth, he reminded himself that friendship was enough. Even if denying himself was slowly breaking something fundamental in his ancient heart. The 2 years between 18 and 20 transformed Marvella from a promising young woman into someone truly extraordinary. She had grown into her beauty, the angular features of adolescence softening into elegance, her violet eyes more striking than ever against porcelain skin. But it wasn't her physical beauty that caught Morvetha's attention or made his ancient heart ache. It was the confidence she carried now, the way she moved through the world with purpose and conviction, the sharp intelligence that made visiting diplomats stumble over their words and seasoned council members reconsider their positions. She had become magnificent. And Morveth was not the only one who noticed. Young nobles began appearing at court with increasing frequency, their visits thinly disguised as diplomatic necessity, but transparently motivated by the desire to be near Princess Marvella. They brought her gifts, flowers, jewelry, books of poetry. They requested dances at state functions. They found excuses to linger in her presence, their intentions written clearly in every calculated compliment and hopeful glance. Morveth watched it all with what he told himself was detached, avuncular approval. She deserved admirers. She deserved to be courted by appropriate suitors, young men closer to her age, without the burden of 8 centuries and the complications of their guardian-ward relationship. But late at night, alone in his chambers, he could admit the truth. Watching other men pursue Marvella was agony. When Duke Therian's son made her laugh at dinner, Morvetha's hand tightened around his wine goblet hard enough to crack the glass. When Lord Castellan brought her a rare first edition of her favorite philosopher's work, Morveth spent the evening composing and discarding a dozen reasons why Castellan was unsuitable. When he saw her dancing with the visiting Prince of Aldenmere, her hand in his, her smile genuine, something in Morvetha's chest twisted so painfully he had to leave the ballroom entirely. It was jealousy. Vicious, consuming, completely inappropriate jealousy. And he hated himself for it. Marvella seemed oblivious to her suitor's attentions. She was polite, gracious, but maintained a careful distance from all of them. More than once, Morveth had prepared himself to support her choice if she showed genuine interest in any of the young men, but she never did. And that small, selfish part of him, the part he despised, was grateful. Her 20th birthday arrived with the first snow of winter. Morvith had arranged a grand celebration, inviting nobles from across the realm. Marvella moved through the festivities with grace and poise, accepting congratulations and gifts, dancing with appropriate partners, playing her role as the beloved princess perfectly. But when she sought him out late in the evening and requested a private audience, Morvith saw something in her eyes that made his centuries-old instincts scream warnings. They retired to his study, a room lined with ancient books and maps, warmed by a fire that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Marvella closed the door behind them and turned to face him, and Morvith noticed her hands were trembling. "Are you well, Marvella?" he asked, concern overriding caution. "If any of the guests made you uncomfortable." "I'm in love with you," she said. The words hit him like a physical blow. For a moment, Morvith couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at her as his world tilted on its axis. "I've been in love with you for over a year," Marvella continued, her voice shaking but determined. "I've tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was gratitude or admiration or anything else. But it's not. It's love. Deep, certain, irrevocable love." She took a step toward him. "I know there's an age difference. I know our situation is complicated. But I'm 20 years old, and I know my own heart. I love you, Morvith. Not because you're a king. Not because you protected me. But because of who you are, your honor, your patience, your terrible loneliness that you hide from everyone but can't quite hide from me." Morvith felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling. Every instinct screamed at him to cross the distance between them, to take her in his arms, to confess that he'd been desperately in love with her for years. But those same instincts had served him for 8 centuries, and they warned him now, *, this is wrong. This is dangerous. This could destroy her, *. "Marvella," he said quietly, and the pain in his voice was unmistakable. "You don't tell me I don't know what I feel," she interrupted, her eyes blazing. "I'm not a child anymore. I know my own mind." "I'm not questioning your sincerity," Morvith said carefully. "But you've lived under my roof since you were 16. I've been the primary authority figure in your life for 4 years. You've been dependent on my goodwill, surrounded by my protection, educated by tutors I chose. How can you be certain what you feel is love and not something else? Something else?" Her voice went cold. "Like what? Gratitude? Stockholm Syndrome?" "Yes," he said bluntly, and watched her flinch. "Marvella, you're brilliant and perceptive and remarkable. But you've never had true freedom to explore the world, to meet other people, to experience life beyond these walls. How can you possibly know that what you feel for me is genuine choice, and not the comfortable familiarity of the only real protection you've ever known?" "Because I know my own heart," she said, her voice breaking. "You think you do," Morvith said gently, even as his own heart shattered. "But I will not, accept a confession of love from someone who has never truly been free to choose otherwise. It would make me exactly the monster you feared when you first arrived. A powerful man taking advantage of a young woman in his care." Tears were streaming down Marvella's face now. "You're not taking advantage. I'm offering freely." "You cannot offer freely when you've never experienced freedom," Morvith interrupted. "And I love you too much to accept anything less than absolute certainty that your choice is real." The confession slipped out before he could stop it. Marvella's eyes went wide. You love me?" "Yes," Morvith said simply. "I have loved you for years. Which is precisely why I cannot do this. If you truly love me, if this is real and not the product of circumstance and familiarity, then you must prove it. To yourself and to me." "How?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "By experiencing the world. By meeting other people, exploring other options, having the freedom to choose without my influence. Only then, only if you still feel the same after having truly experienced freedom, can I believe your choice is real." Marvella stared at him, heartbreak and fury warring in her expression. "You're sending me away." "I'm giving you freedom," Morvith corrected quietly. The freedom I promised you 4 years ago. And if you return to me, if you still feel the same after seeing the world, after being courted by men who don't carry the complications of our history, then I will believe you. Then I will accept what you're offering. And if I refuse? If I stay and insist, then I will always wonder, Morvith said, his voice breaking. I will always fear that I took advantage of you. And that fear will poison whatever we might have had. Marvella closed her eyes, tears still falling. When she opened them again, the heartbreak in them nearly destroyed him. I hate you for this, she whispered. I know, Morvith said. But I love you too much to do anything else. She left without another word, and Morvith stood alone in his study, listening to her footsteps fade, wondering if he'd just made the greatest sacrifice of his immortal life, or the greatest mistake. Did King Morvith make the right choice to send Marvella away, even though he loved her? Subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. The announcement came 3 days after Marvella's confession, delivered in the formal throne room with the full court in attendance. Morvith stood before his assembled nobles, his face a mask of calm authority that betrayed none of the agony tearing him apart inside. Marvella stood to his right, her expression carefully blank, though he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were clasped too tightly in front of her. Princess Marvella Thornwick has been under the protection of this crown for 4 years, Morvith announced, his voice carrying through the silent hall. She has received the finest education, proven herself brilliant in matters of state and diplomacy, and earned the genuine affection and respect of this court. He paused, forcing himself to continue. She has also reached the age where she must consider her future, specifically, the question of marriage. To ensure that any choice she makes is entirely her own, free from the influence of familiarity or obligation, I am formally sponsoring her grand tour of the realm. Murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles. For 1 full year, Princess Marvella will travel to the great kingdoms, meeting with their noble houses, attending their courts, and entertaining the courtship of any suitors she deems worthy of consideration. She will see the world beyond these walls, experience life in other courts, and have the absolute freedom to form connections without constraint. He finally allowed himself to look at Marvella. Her violet eyes were fixed on him, bright with unshed tears and barely contained fury. At the end of that year, if she chooses to return, she will do so as a woman who has truly seen her options and made an informed decision about her future. Any marriage she chooses, whether to a prince of a foreign kingdom, a noble of this realm, or anyone else, will have my full support and blessing. The unspoken alternative hung in the air, or she could choose to return to me. But Morvith couldn't say that. Wouldn't say it. This had to be her choice, made freely, without pressure or expectation. Marvella stood frozen for a long moment. Then she executed a perfect, frigid curtsy. Your Majesty is most generous, she said, her voice like ice. I accept this opportunity. She left the throne room without waiting to be dismissed, and Morvith watched her go, wondering if he would ever see her again. She departed a week later with an escort of guards, a substantial traveling fund, and letters of introduction to every major court in the realm. Morvith stood on the battlements and watched her carriage disappear down the mountain road, and felt something in his chest crack and splinter. The reports began arriving within a month. Princess Marvella had been received at the court of Silver Peak with great enthusiasm. Prince Aldrich, heir to the Silver Peak throne, had personally escorted her on a tour of their legendary sky gardens. They had dined together privately. He had presented her with a necklace of moon opals. Morvith read the report 3 times, his jaw clenched so tightly his teeth ached. The next report came 2 weeks later. Marvella had moved on to the coastal kingdom of Merivalli. Duke Torrin's son, Captain Greaves, a celebrated naval commander known for his charm and good looks, had taken her sailing. They had spent an afternoon exploring tide pools. He had made her laugh. Morvith burned that report in his fireplace and immediately hated himself for the childish gesture. More reports followed in steady succession. The merchant prince of Golden Avon had offered her a tour of his legendary libraries. The young king of Thornmarch had invited her to hunt in his private forest preserve. Lord Castellan, the same man who had given her the rare book months ago, had arranged a private concert with the realm's most famous musicians in her honor. Each report was a fresh knife wound. Each description of Marvella smiling at another man, dancing with another suitor, accepting another gift, felt like watching her slip further away. His council noticed his deteriorating mood. "You could recall her," Lord Chancellor Sereth suggested carefully during one particularly tense meeting. "Send word that her presence is required at court for some urgent matter." "No," Morvith said flatly. "She must have the full year. She must have absolute freedom." "Your Majesty, forgive my bluntness, but you're torturing yourself. Everyone can see it." "My comfort is irrelevant," Morvith said. "What matters is that if she makes her choice, it's untainted by obligation or limited options." 6 months passed in this agonizing limbo. 6 months of reports detailing Marvella's progress through the courts, the men who pursued her, the attention she received. 6 months of Morvith maintaining his rigid composure during the day and pacing his chambers like a caged animal at night, imagining her falling in love with someone else, someone appropriate, someone who could give her a normal life without the complications of their history. The rational part of his mind insisted this was the right thing, the honorable thing. She deserved the chance to explore the world, to be courted by men who hadn't been her guardian, to make a choice free from the weight of their complicated past. But the irrational part, the part that had fallen helplessly in love with her sharp mind and fierce spirit, was screaming that he'd made the greatest mistake of his immortal life. That he'd had something precious and rare, and he'd sent it away out of excessive honor and fear. The worst report came in the 8th month. Prince Aldrich of Silverpeak had formally proposed marriage. The proposal was respectful, generous, and by all accounts, Marvella had requested time to consider it rather than refusing outright. Morvith sat alone in his study that night, the report clutched in his hand, and for the first time in 800 years, seriously contemplated getting drunk enough to forget his own name. He had done this to himself. Pushed her away out of noble intentions and fear of taking advantage. Given her the freedom he'd promised, even knowing it might mean losing her forever. If she accepted Prince Aldrich's proposal, Morvith would attend the wedding. He would give his blessing. He would smile and congratulate them both and never let anyone see that his ancient heart was breaking. Because that was what honor demanded. And honor was all he had left. The 9th month passed with no word of her accepting Aldrich's proposal, but no word of rejection either. Morvith existed in a state of suspended agony, waiting for news that would either destroy him or give him the faintest glimmer of hope. And then, 2 weeks before the year was complete, an unexpected report arrived. Princess Marvella had abruptly concluded her tour. She was returning to Darksunder Keep. Morvith's hands shook as he read the brief message. She was coming home. But the report gave no indication why, or what decision she had made, or whether she was returning to say goodbye before accepting one of her suitors. She would arrive in 3 days. 3 days to prepare himself for whatever she had chosen. 3 days to shore up his composure and ready himself to either accept the greatest gift he'd ever been given, or lose the only person he'd loved in centuries. 3 days of the most exquisite torture he'd ever endured. Morvith stood in the courtyard as Marvella's carriage arrived, his heart hammering in a way it hadn't in 8 centuries. 3 days of waiting had nearly destroyed what remained of his composure. Now, watching her step down from the carriage in a traveling dress of deep emerald, he couldn't breathe. She looked different. More confident, somehow. Her hair was longer, pulled back in an elegant style he'd never seen her wear before. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had moved through the highest courts of the realm and emerged unintimidated. But it was her eyes that captured him, those striking violet eyes that met his directly, burning with purpose and determination. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "I request a private audience. Immediately." "Not a request. A demand." "Of course," Princess Morvith managed, gesturing toward the castle. "My study." They walked through the familiar corridors in silence, the tension between them so thick it was nearly suffocating. Servants scattered at their approach, sensing something momentous was about to occur. Once inside his study, Marvella closed the door and turned to face him. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, and Morvith saw something in her expression that made his ancient heart clench with desperate hope. "You sent me away for a year," she said quietly, "to prove my choice was free, to ensure I had experienced the world and all my options before making a decision." "Yes," Morvith said. "I met them all. Every suitor you could have imagined. Prince Aldrich of Silver Peak, who was kind and charming and offered me a kingdom by the sea. Captain Greaves, who made me laugh and showed me adventures I'd never dreamed of. The merchant prince who could have given me access to every book ever written. Lord Castellan, who understood my love of philosophy. King Darius of Thornmarch, who was brave and honorable and genuinely good." Each name was a knife wound, but Morvith forced himself to listen. "They were all appropriate," Marvella continued. "All closer to my age. All offering me normal lives without complications or power imbalances or the weight of our history. Any one of them would have been a perfectly acceptable choice." She took a step toward him. "And every single one of them was a pale imitation of you." The words hit Morvith like a physical blow. "Do you know what I realized after 6 months of being courted by the realm's most eligible men?" Marvella's voice was steady now, certain. "That not one of them would have done what you did. Not one of them would have voided a legal contract to protect a terrified 16-year-old's freedom. Not one of them would have spent 4 years maintaining respectful distance despite their own feelings. Not one of them would have sent away the woman they loved just to ensure her choice was completely free." She was directly in front of him now, close enough that he could smell lavender in her hair, see the gold flecks in her violet eyes. "Prince Aldrich was charming, but when I mentioned I disagreed with his kingdom's trade policies, he dismissed my concerns as adorably spirited. Captain Greaves was adventurous, but he wanted a wife to admire his accomplishments, not challenge his thinking. The merchant prince collected beautiful things, and that's exactly how he saw me. A beautiful thing to add to his collection." Her hand came up to rest against his chest, directly over his heart. "You're the only man I've ever met who saw me as an equal. Who valued my mind as much as anything else. Who loved me enough to let me go, even though it was destroying you. How did you?" "The reports went both ways, Morvith," she said softly. "My guards sent word back about how you looked when you read about my suitors. How you stopped eating properly. How you paced the battlements at night like a man being slowly tortured." She smiled, and it was radiant. "You were suffering as much as I was. Because you loved me enough to want my happiness more than your own. That's when I knew, with absolute certainty, that you were the only choice I would ever want to make." "Marvella," Morvith said, his voice breaking. "I'm 800 years older than you. I'm a vampire. I was your guardian. The power differential is irrelevant," she interrupted firmly. "Because you spent 4 years proving you would never abuse that power. You gave me education, protection, and freedom. You voided the contract that bound me. You sent me away when I confessed my love, even though it hurt you, because you wanted me to be certain. You did everything right, Morvith. Everything honorable. And that's exactly why I'm standing here, having rejected every other option, choosing you." She looked up at him, her violet eyes blazing with certainty. "I'm 21 years old. I've seen the world. I've met the alternatives. I've had complete freedom to choose anyone or choose no one at all. And I choose you. Not because you're a king. Not because you protected me. Not because of familiarity or gratitude or Stockholm Syndrome or any other reason you've tortured yourself with." Her other hand came up to cup his face. I choose you because of your honor, your patience, your terrible loneliness that you try so hard to hide, the way you value my mind and respect my choices, the way you love me enough to deny yourself for my sake. I choose you, Morvith. Freely, completely, irrevocably. Tears were streaming down her face now. So I'm asking you, begging you, please stop being so honorable and just accept what I'm offering. I love you. I will always love you. And I need you to say you'll accept that love, because I can't spend another moment wondering if your honor will keep us apart forever. For 800 years, Morvith had prided himself on control, on doing the right thing regardless of personal cost, on maintaining boundaries and respecting power differentials and never taking advantage. But standing there, with Marvella's hands on him, her love offered freely after she'd had every opportunity to choose otherwise, he felt that control finally, blessedly break. I love you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I have loved you for so long. And, if you're absolutely certain this is what you want. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Marvella said. Morvith closed the distance between them and kissed her. It was gentle at first, reverent. 800 years of loneliness and 4 years of denied longing poured into that single point of contact. Then Marvella's hands tangled in his hair, and she kissed him back with fierce determination, and gentle became passionate, became a promise, became the beginning of something that had been years in the making. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Morvith rested his forehead against hers. Are you sure? He asked one last time. Marvella laughed, the sound bright with joy. I traveled 6 months through every kingdom in the realm just to be certain I wanted to come back to you. Yes, you stubborn, honorable, wonderful man. I'm sure. And Morvith, finally, allowed himself to believe it. The announcement of their courtship sent shockwaves through the realm. King Morvith Darksunder, the ancient vampire king who had ruled for 8 centuries in deliberate solitude, was formally courting his former ward. The scandalmongers prepared for a feast of gossip, ready to whisper about impropriety and abuse of power. They were disappointed. Because Morvith and Marvella conducted their courtship with such transparent honesty and propriety that even the most determined critics couldn't find fault. They courted publicly, always chaperoned, always visible. They took walks through the gardens with attendants trailing at a respectful distance. They attended state functions together, dancing the proper number of dances and no more. They dined in the formal hall rather than private chambers, their conversations witnessed by the entire court. And in those conversations, witnessed by hundreds, something beautiful became clear. This was not a powerful man manipulating a young woman. This was 2 people who genuinely delighted in each other's company, who challenged each other intellectually, who treated each other with profound respect and affection. She argues with him about policy, one noble observed with amazement after watching Marvella firmly but respectfully dismantle one of Morvitha's proposed trade agreements during a council meeting. And he listens. He defers to her judgment. Another noted when Morvith publicly changed his position on a diplomatic matter after Marvella pointed out a flaw in his reasoning. The relationship the court witnessed wasn't one of dominance and submission. It was partnership. Equality. 2 brilliant minds that complemented and challenged each other. In private, carefully chaperoned private moments in the library or solar, they shared deeper truths. I'm afraid, Morvith confessed one evening, his hand carefully holding hers across a proper distance. That I'll outlive you. That I'll have perhaps 60 years with you, and then centuries of remembering. That sounds ungrateful, but... It's not ungrateful, Marvella interrupted gently. It's honest. And I'm afraid too. Afraid that I'll grow old while you stay young. Afraid that you'll regret choosing someone so temporary. Never, Morvith said fiercely. 60 years with you is worth 600 years of loneliness. And you will never be temporary to me, Marvella. You'll be the woman who changed everything. She smiled, tears in her eyes. Then we'll make every year count. We'll build something that lasts beyond either of us. A legacy that matters. What kind of legacy? Marvella's expression turned serious. I keep thinking about that contract. About how my father sold me to pay his debts and how legal it was. How many other girls are trapped in similar arrangements right now without a king honorable enough to void the contract? Morvith felt something shift in his chest. What are you proposing? A sanctuary, Marvella said, her voice growing stronger. A law that any woman bound by an unfair contract can appeal to the crown for protection. A place where they can come, be educated, be safe, and choose their own futures. What you gave me, we could give to others. A legacy of freedom, Morvith said slowly, and felt purpose crystallize. Yes, we'll make it our first act as king and queen. The courtship year passed in careful steps and deepening connection. Every doubt Morvith had harbored about the appropriateness of their relationship was slowly dissolved by the reality of Marvella's certainty. She never wavered. Never looked at him with anything less than fierce love and determination. On the morning of her 22nd birthday, Morvith requested her presence in the throne room. The entire court was assembled, just as they had been 6 years ago when he'd voided the marriage contract. Marvella entered, radiant in a gown of midnight blue, and Morvith felt his breath catch at the sight of her. He descended from his throne and dropped to one knee before her, ignoring the collective gasp of the assembled nobles. Princess Marvella Thornwick, he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall. 6 years ago, I voided a contract that would have bound you to me without your choice. I promised you freedom, education, and the right to choose your own future. He pulled out a ring, a simple band of white gold set with a single violet stone that matched her eyes perfectly. You have had that freedom. You have seen the world, met every alternative, had every option available to you. And you chose to return. You chose me. Not because you had to. Not because you were obligated or grateful or trapped. But because you wanted to. Tears were streaming down Marvella's face. So now I'm asking, not as your former guardian, not as your king, but as a man who loves you more than 8 centuries of life have taught me to express, will you marry me? Will you be my queen, my partner, my equal in all things? Yes, Marvella said, her voice breaking with joy. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. Morvith slipped the ring onto her finger and stood, pulling her into his arms as the throne room erupted in cheers. They married 3 months later in a ceremony that celebrated not just their union, but the principle it represented, that love built on choice and respect was stronger than any obligation. Their first act as king and queen was to establish the Thornwick Sanctuary, named for Marvella's house, reclaiming the name that had once represented her father's betrayal and transforming it into a symbol of protection. Any woman bound by an unfair contract could petition the crown for sanctuary. They would be educated, protected, and given the freedom to choose their own futures. Within a year, 15 young women had found refuge there. Within 5 years, the sanctuary had inspired similar institutions across the realm. The very nature of marriage contracts began to change, with clauses requiring consent and provisions for voiding agreements built on coercion. Morvith and Marvella ruled together for 63 years. Every day, Morvith watched her grow older, and every day, he loved her more fiercely. When she finally passed, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, her last words were, "I chose well." And Morvith, left to face the centuries ahead without her, knew that she had. They both had. Because their love hadn't just transformed 2 lives. It had transformed a kingdom, establishing a legacy that would protect countless women for generations to come. A legacy built on patience, honor, and the revolutionary idea that true love could only exist where there was freedom to choose. What lesson from Morvith and Marvella's story touched your heart the most? Was it his patience, her courage, or the legacy they built together? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you love this tale of honor and choice, subscribe, and turn on notifications for our next epic story. Thank you for joining us on this journey.